Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Greg Stewart, and this is number 2 in a series of videos I am doing to promote my book, I Cubed, Unlock the Inner Strength Behind Your Negative Emotions, coming out spring of 2025. So we're continuing the chapter of the story we tell ourselves. So throughout this book, I'm going to be sharing just personal stories about my own growth and development as a person, but also laying the foundation for, as I look back, all the experience that I've had in forming my careers as a pastor, counselor, professor, coach, and consultant. So there's going to be sort of a professional approach to this, but also a very, very personal approach. I often tell clients that everything that I'm giving them as far as counseling and coaching per se, I've already ran through the system of Greg. So at this point, I am 53 years old and made a lot of mistakes in my life, and I have responded to those mistakes doing deep dives into my own heart and soul, and kind of unpacked and tried to figure out exactly what's going on inside of me. So when it comes to negative emotions, you're going to see that obviously behind this entire book is they are not to be avoided. They're not to be looked at in a poor way, but they are going to be looked at as a pathway to uncover a lot that is going on in our heart and souls. In the formation of this process, I'm going to tell you some stories. Like the first story I want to tell is my dad, who was a guy who worked at General Motors. He was one of the last people of the generation of, they worked 30 years and out. It's called the 30 years and out generation, where they worked 30 years at a factory or at a job, and then they retired and was able to do so. And they retired early at both my mom and my dad retired like 52 years old. So they were my age when they retired. So that would be awesome. But those days are long gone. And I remember one time when I was a kid, my dad coming home, and even though he was just an individual contributor at General Motors at his plant in Kalamazoo, Michigan, he often would come home and talk about management and leadership and the change that the plant was going through. And one of those principles he shared with me was actually on the principle of organizational change. So he drew two vertical lines on the sheet or whatever it was, and he wrote status quo in the middle between those two lines. And on the left side, I think the word was promoters of change, and on the left side, there was a resistors of change. And he was walking me through that the status quo was in this kind of push factor in between the two promoters and resistors, and how organizational change would happen. And then, so when change was desired by the promoters, why was that change desired? And when change was resisted by the resistors, why was that change resisted? So the promoters really wanted to improve the status quo of the plant, but the resistors thought everything was fine the way it is. How do we go through the process of change? So the only way to do it was for the promoters to come over to the side of the resistors and basically be empathic, to listen to them, what their fears of the change were, and then talk to them about what the change would do to answer those fears. Of course, the resistors would try and do the same, but over the course of time, if the change was good, then the status quo would shift, and then a new status quo would be developed. It was a phenomenal principle as far as my opening the eyes of what organizational change was, which impacted my career, as you will see in the book. But I first stepped back and then asked the question more on a personal level. So when it comes to change, why would truly people want to change anything to begin with? And then more than that, why would people resist it? When it came to our own individual souls and our own personalities and our own thing, what was the status quo within inside us? So then I started to observe things that I wanted to change within me. And then not only that, I started to discover how hard the change process was. And then I started observing everybody else, saying, my goodness, everybody wants to change, which is fine, but why don't they just change? Why don't I just change? If I want to change something about myself, why not just change? And then I started realizing that within me and within others, there were promoters of change and then the resistors of change. And the promoters of change within us was, again, to achieve the emotional goal of a higher quality of life, right? So I envisioned like I'm doing certain habits or behaviors I don't want to do, or I wanted to add habits and behaviors, like let's say exercise or learning a new skill set. I wanted to add behaviors and habits to me, just improve my quality of life. But the resistors of change ended up being the negative emotions. And number one, out of the fact that changing a habit is hard because we are more committed to what's familiar than what's healthy. But also, when it came to this change process, I realized that there were negative emotions producing this struggle for change. Like I said in the last video, that my current thing, there was a reward, emotional reward to my current habit. That's why I was so committed to it. But secondly, the change process and the struggle is kind of like the negative emotions of defensiveness. Well, if I need to change, then people point out that I was failing before and now I want to be better. So there's defensiveness and insecurity and anxiety and fear and worry, anger and depression, all playing in as the resistors of that change. And that was the factor of the status quo tug and war inside of me, and then trying to figure out how do I actually accomplish the change process when sometimes, like with anger, it was so quick and so fast that my anger response, and I respond that way, but it happened so fast. How did I change it? How do I change that process? So in this working through process that I've been going through my whole life, I started to come up with, of course, in my education and such, the theories of change. So the biggest one, it has to do really with the aspect of the negative emotions. So I found that negative emotions, especially when it came to anger, because of my personality and temperament, it's not like I was punching holes in walls or anything, but I had a rush of anger. I started to unpack those. The same thing with like insecurity and fear. And I just stepped back within myself and said, why do I have such a strong negative emotion? It wasn't just the existence of the negative emotion like insecurity or anger or fear. It was the intensity of it. Why was it so huge? Especially when it came to anger, that I became angry about something. And I remember this as a child, that I was like, wait a minute, if I do nothing, literally nothing, and nothing changes in 24 hours or in my anger will almost be nothing. And if nothing changes, why? Why is it, number one, I'm so angry to begin with? But secondly, if I did nothing, my anger would naturally subside. So then I started thinking, why don't I just grab what I'm going to experience in a day or two or whatever, and then bring it to the present. So stepping back, and just, I think the way the Lord created me was just this process of looking at negative emotions and then facing them head on and saying, okay, figuring out, instead of looking at the environment as the cause of the negative emotions or being so down on myself, I would walk right into the negative emotions and unpack them. And another piece to this, basically on the timing of the book, is I believe there's obviously been a strong increase in the vilifying of negative emotions over the last 20 to 30 years. People have been avoiding them like the plague. And if somebody feels negative emotions, then we try and soothe them that you shouldn't feel these negative emotions. Or if they feel negative emotions by the environment is the one that has to change. That it's almost like if they make you feel bad, then by definition they are bad. So it's just a process. You made me feel bad, so you're bad. So in this vilifying of negative emotions, I want to use this book, use this material to change the course of that. We're not going to vilify negative emotions. We're going to walk into them. And instead of seeing negative emotions that, people who create negative emotions and actually kind of expose what needs to be exposed and pointed out what needs to be pointed out, instead of being demonized and canceled, let's walk into and not be afraid of negative emotions, because, the whole proverbial, the truth shall set you free. And that is another major driving force behind this book. Is there's no more vilifying of negative emotions, for no more confusion, no more lies. Let's walk into these negative emotions, because in my own journey, again, speaking from my own experience, what I'm sharing with you is ran through the system of grid, is there is such an incredible amount of wealth of information about me, insight and wisdom. I want to grow. I want to mature. I want to go deep into the heart and soul and unpack these negative emotions, these fears, worries, insecurities. And I want to take that information and lay it before the God of the universe, getting his insight into me, because my proposal is that is where the richness of life is found. It's not found in just doing anything we can to appease our present tense negative emotions as a band-aid or a coping skill, or to blame the environment and force the environment to adjust itself so I don't feel negative emotions. It's immature. It is so surface. It is so invaluable. But switching it to let's walk into our negative emotions and unpack them, and talking about shifting the status quo, that the true richness and joy and peace of life is found in walking right into these negative emotions. Thank you so much. More videos to come. Please share and subscribe, and we shall see you next week.